The storm had turned the world into a blur of darkness and water. Rain pounded so hard against the canyon walls that even the river below roared like a living beast, swollen and angry from the night's downpour. The sky tore open again with a jagged streak of lightning, painting the desert cliffs white for a heartbeat, before thunder rolled across the land with the sound of mountains breaking. Inside a weathered cabin half hidden against the rock face, Dakota sat silent by a low fire. The Apache warrior had built this place with his own hands, plank by plank, years ago when he had sworn himself to solitude. Smoke curled lazily from the hearth, carrying the faint scent of sage and pine sap he had burned to keep his mind clear. For Dakota, nights like these were a reminder of the storms inside him, the ones that had never truly passed. He was sharpening his knife when it happened, the sound that didn't belong. Knock, knock, not the groan of old timber, not the pee-hung, not the key-hung. Shriek of the wind, a fist. A desperate, human fist striking wood through the downpour. Dakota's hand froze mid-motion. No one came this far into the canyon, not unless they were lost, hunted, or foolish. Slowly, his fingers drifted toward the rifle resting against the wall. His body went still, every sense reaching outward into the storm. Another knock came, weaker this time, muffled by the hammering rain. With a silent breath, he rose and crossed the room. His moccasins made no sound on the wooden floor. He set his hand against the door, feeling the tremor of another faint strike on the other side. Whoever it was, they were nearly spent. Dakota pulled the latch. The door groaned open, and lightning cracked across the canyon again. For a brief moment, he saw her. A woman soaked through to the bone, hair plastered against her face, eyes wide with terror. She couldn't have been more than 30, but hardship had carved lines of exhaustion across her skin. Mud and blood streaked her cheeks, the scarlet running in rivulets down her arm where fabric clung dark to a deep wound. And in her trembling arms, wrapped in a sodden blanket, was a baby no more than a few months old, wailing against the storm as though begging the world for mercy. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She staggered forward, nearly collapsing against the doorframe, only barely catching herself to shield the child from the fall. Dakota stepped back, eyes narrowing. He had faced ambush before, and many times settlers had sent women as bait. But there was no mistaking the way her knees buckled or the way her fingers clutched the infant like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. "Please," she rasped, her voice raw, shredded by wind and fear. "Please, help us." Dakota's jaw tightened. He had told himself long ago that he owed the world nothing. He had lost his family to a raid, his people scattered, his name cursed in 2 tongues. Yet here she was, dripping rain onto his floor, holding out the smallest and most fragile life he had seen in years. The baby's cries pierced the cabin, thin but desperate, carrying through the crackle of the fire. Dakota saw how the woman swayed on her feet, her strength bleeding out with every drop of rainwater falling from her clothes. She pressed the child to her chest, as though she could give it her heartbeat in place of its own. She collapsed then, knees giving way, and crumpled onto the wooden boards. The baby screamed louder, startled by the sudden jolt. Dakota dropped his rifle from reach and moved quickly, crouching beside them. He saw the wound clearly now, a long, angry gash down her arm, red and swollen from days of exposure. The woman was shivering violently, her skin pale beneath the grime. She lifted her eyes to his, glassy with pain and exhaustion. "Don't send me back out there," she whispered. Her words hit harder than the thunder outside. Dakota said nothing. He studied her in the firelight, weighing risk against instinct, silence against compassion. His people had been betrayed when they gave help to strangers before. Yet looking at her half-dead, clutching life to her chest, begging for nothing but shelter, he felt something stir deep in his chest. something he thought he had buried alongside his past. The storm howled through the canyon, rattling the shutters. As if to demand an answer, Dakota made his choice. He lifted the baby first, awkward in his broad hands, surprised at how light the child was, how fragile. Then he slid his other arm beneath the woman's shoulders and pulled her gently toward the fire. She gasped at the movement, pain flashing across her face, but relief followed quickly as warmth touched her skin. For the first time in years, Dakota had let another soul into his cabin. The storm raged on outside, but inside, something had shifted. Something alive. Something dangerous. Something that would change everything. The cabin smelled of smoke, damp wood, and something faintly medicinal sage Dakota had burned earlier to cleanse the air. The fire cracked weakly in the stone hearth, struggling against the damp that the storm had forced through the walls. Shadows danced along the cabin's rough timbers, making the small space feel alive, restless. Dakota placed the baby down on a folded blanket near the fire. The child's cries quieted at once, tiny hands reaching toward the glow. Dakota had expected the infant to wail endlessly, but instead the small creature blinked and hiccuped, then nestled into the warmth as if it had always belonged there. The woman, this stranger who had thrown her fate, into his hands slumped heavily against the wall, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. She tried to sit straighter, but her body betrayed her, trembling violently. Her lips parted as if to speak, but all that came out was a sharp breath. Dakota crouched beside her, his dark eyes assessing. The wound in her arm needed tending. The gash was ugly, swollen, and caked with mud, rainwater, and blood. She had walked far with it, carried a child through a storm while half her strength bled into the earth. He saw the faint purpling of skin around the cut and knew infection would soon come if nothing was done. Without a word, he pulled a bundle of cloth from a shelf and dipped it in a pot of water he had warmed by the fire earlier that evening. She flinched when he reached for her arm. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low, gravelly from years of silence. Her wide eyes met his. For the first time, he caught the color of them gray like storm clouds, rimmed red from exhaustion and tears. She swallowed, then nodded faintly, letting him guide her arm closer to the firelight. The heat made her wound sting. She bit her lip until it bled rather than cry out. Dakota admired that. Most would have wailed or cursed, but she sat there trembling, letting him clean the dirt from her flesh. He bound her arm tightly with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt of his, then sat back, studying his work. She finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." Dakota inclined his head once. He was not a man of unnecessary words. Minutes passed in silence, except for the crackle of the fire and the distant thunder still rolling through the canyon. The baby stirred, gave a soft whimper, then settled again. The woman's eyes softened. As she watched the child, her hand trembling when she reached out to stroke its tiny face. Dakota could not look away from that gesture, the raw tenderness, the fierce devotion. When she looked back at him, her lips trembled. "My name is Alela." She paused, swallowing hard, as though speaking her own name was suddenly painful. "Please, don't send me back out there. I'll die." "And so will he." Her voice cracked on the last word. Dakota said nothing, but inside, the weight of her plea struck him. He had once stood where she stood, begging for mercy that never came. He had once carried the dead in his arms while the living turned him away. Still, he studied her closely, searching for falsehood. "Why come here?" he asked at last, his voice quiet but sharp. Eliza closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. When she opened them, tears pooled. "I didn't mean to. I followed the canyon, thinking maybe the river would lead me to a town. I saw smoke. I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. I thought maybe God left one soul in this land kind enough to open a door. Dakota's chest tightened. She had not come to him with threats nor with weapons. Only with a child and a wound. You should rest, he said, turning away before she could see the conflict in his expression. He added more wood to the fire, the flames licking higher, filling the cabin with warmth. Eliza leaned back against the wall, eyelids heavy, though she fought to keep them open. You'll be safe here, he said finally, the words tasting strange on his tongue. For now. Her breath shuddered, relief softening her face, though her eyes still carried the shadow of fear. She looked at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. Then her body yielded, exhaustion claiming her at last. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder more distant now. Inside, the firelight glowed steady, wrapping the cabin in fragile safety. Dakota sat cross-legged near the door, silent as stone, keeping watch. His rifle lay within reach, but his gaze often strayed to the sleeping child. For the first time in many winters, his cabin was not empty. And he knew, deep in his bones, that emptiness would never return so easily again. Eliza awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the soft crackle of fire. For the first time in days, her body wasn't drenched in rain or shivering from cold. But the moment she tried to move her arm, pain seared through it like fire racing up her veins. She gasped, the sound sharp in the silence of the cabin. Dakota turned from where he crouched near the door, his silhouette broad and still, his eyes watching everything without giving anything away. He said nothing, but his gaze flicked to her bandaged arm, then to the baby still sleeping soundly near the hearth. You bound it, she whispered, her voice rough. He nodded once. It will hold for now. Eliza tried to push herself upright, her body weak and trembling, but stubbornness carried her where strength failed. She gathered her child into her arms, pressing her lips to his tiny head, breathing him in as though reassuring herself he was still alive. Only then did she look back at Dakota. I owe you my life, she said, though the words tasted bitter. She had learned long ago that every debt came with a cost. Dakota didn't reply. His silence was heavier than words, yet not unkind. He was. Watching her, she realized the way a hawk studies something new in its sky, not with cruelty, but with wariness. The fire warmed the cabin, but Eliza's heart carried its own cold storm. She had been running so long that sitting still felt unnatural, like waiting for death. And yet this man, this warrior with eyes like stone, had taken her in when no one else had. She tightened her hold on the baby, and at last the story tumbled from her lips. My husband's name was Matthew, she began, her voice trembling. We came west chasing promises, land, freedom, a chance to raise our boy without hunger. She swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the infant. But promises turned to graves out here. Dakota's face remained unreadable, but his gaze sharpened. They came at dawn, she continued, her words spilling faster now, as though once spoken they could not be stopped. Outlaws. 3 of them, maybe more. They wanted what we had: supplies, money, anything. Matthew tried to fight them. He? Her throat closed and her hand shook as she wiped at her face. He didn't survive. The fire popped, sending sparks upward, and for a moment the silence was unbearable. Eliza forced herself to go on. I ran. Took the baby, grabbed what little I could carry. They've been chasing me ever since. I don't know how I made it. Through the river, through the storm. I thought, maybe if I kept moving, they'd give up, her voice cracked. But men like that don't stop. Dakota's jaw tightened. He had known such men all his life, the kind who fed on weakness, who believed gold or blood made them kings. What do they want? He asked at last. Eliza hesitated. Her fingers fumbled with the satchel she still carried, soaked and frayed. She pulled it close, her breath uneven. then slowly unwrapped the bundle within. The firelight glinted on gold coins, dozens of them, heavy in their pouch, enough to make men kill and keep killing. My husband saved every dollar, working the she said, her voice raw with bitterness. This is all that's left of his years of sweat, his lungs filled with dust. He wanted us to build something with it, a farm, a future. She looked at the pouch as though it were cursed. Instead, it bought his death. And now it's a beacon, drawing wolves to me. Dakota stared at the gold, expression unreadable. To his people, such wealth had never meant freedom-only shackles, broken promises, and graves. And yet he understood why men would chase her through storm and canyon for it. You should have left it behind, he said quietly. Her head snapped. Up, gray eyes burning. And let him die for nothing? Let them take everything he gave his life for. No, I can't. I won't. Her voice was fierce, almost startling against the fragility of her body. Dakota saw then that beneath the exhaustion, beneath the trembling, there was steel. She was not just surviving, she was defying. The baby stirred, letting out a small cry. Eliza rocked him gently, pressing her cheek to his downy hair until he quieted again. Her tears wet his skin, but her arms held steady. Dakota rose slowly, his towering figure casting long shadows across the cabin. His silence stretched on, but within it, Eliza felt the weight of his decision forming. Whether he chose to help her further or send her back into the storm, her fate balanced on his wordless judgment. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside, rattling against the cabin walls. At last, Dakota spoke. Gold brings only death, he said, his voice low, final. But the child? His eyes softened as they lingered on the boy. The child deserves to live. Eliza closed her eyes, clutching her baby tighter. Relief and fear warred inside her. She didn't know what future awaited, only that this warrior had not turned her away. And in that fragile moment, sitting by a stranger's fire, she dared to believe that hope might still exist, even in a land built on loss. The storm passed with the pale light of dawn, leaving the canyon washed clean, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than thunder. The river ran swollen and angry, carrying broken branches and mud downstream. Mist clung to the cliffs like breath that refused to fade. Dakota stepped outside into the damp air, his moccasins sinking slightly into the wet earth. Years of survival had trained his eyes to see what others missed. And there, plain as the scars on his own skin, he saw them prints. Horses, at least 3, maybe more, pressed deep into the mud not far from his cabin. Fresh. The hunters were close. He crouched low, running his fingers over the tracks. The hoof marks cut sharp, water filling them too slowly to erase the story. Whoever rode those horses had been near during the storm, watching, waiting. Dakota rose, his jaw tightening. He returned to the cabin quickly, his broad shoulders glistening with rain as he stepped through the door. Inside, Eliza was awake, sitting cross-legged by the fire with the baby in her lap. Her hair hung in damp strands around her face, her gray eyes red from lack of sleep. When she saw his expression, her body went rigid. "They're close, aren't they?" she asked, her voice trembling though she tried to steady it. Dakota nodded once. He did not soften the truth. 3 riders, maybe more. They know you're here. Her arms tightened around the baby instinctively, her fingers trembling as she stroked the child's head. "They'll kill me," she whispered. "They won't stop until they have what they want." Dakota crouched across from her, his presence filling the small space. His eyes, dark and unreadable, searched hers. What did they want? Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a heartbeat, she seemed ready to deny it. But then her eyes flicked toward the satchel that lay near the hearth. The pouch of gold sat heavy within it, its weight a curse as real as any bullet. "They'll never stop while I have it," she admitted. Her voice cracked. It's all that's left of Matthew. His work, his life. He died for it. I've carried it since." Dakota's gaze lingered on her face, then dropped to the infant cooing against her breast. The gold might buy a farm, but it would also bring death to her and the boy long before any plow touched soil. "Gold is a curse," he said finally, voice low. "It has killed more than bullets." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She lifted her chin, jaw trembling but set. "And yet I can't let it go. If I give it up, it's like he died for nothing." The fire popped between them, throwing sparks. Dakota's silence weighed heavy, but she did not break beneath it. She rocked her baby slowly, her strength wrapped in the rhythm of a mother's love. At last, Dakota stood, pulling a long bow from the wall and stringing it with practiced ease. He set a quiver at his side, the arrows glinting faintly in the firelight. His knife, sharp from last night's honing, slid into its sheath across his chest. The warrior had not sought war in many years, but war had found him all the same. Eliza watched, her throat tight. "You mean to fight them?" His gaze cut to hers. "If they come, yes." Her breath shook. She had seen enough blood to know what that meant. She wanted to beg him not to take her child and flee into the wilderness instead. But she knew the truth. She was too weak, too slow, too marked by blood. Without him, she would not last an hour. Dakota moved to the door and pulled it open. The morning air carried a faint smell of smoke. Not his fire, someone else's. He stepped outside, eyes narrowing. On the ridge across the canyon, tiny flickers danced. Flames. Signal fires. Eliza came to the doorway, clutching her baby. Her face drained of color as she followed his gaze. "What does it mean?" she asked, though dread already curled in her chest. "They're calling each other," Dakota said, his tone like stone. "Gathering." Her knees weakened, and she pressed herself against the doorframe for balance. She could almost see them already, shadows on horseback, faces twisted by greed and hunger. Circling like vultures, she looked at Dakota, at his bare chest gleaming with sweat and rain, the tribal jewelry resting against skin scarred by battles long past. He seemed carved from the earth itself, unyielding, eternal. Yet he was just one man against many. "You should leave us," she whispered, tears finally breaking loose. "You don't owe me your life. You don't owe us anything." Dakota's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving the ridge. "You knocked on my door," he said simply. "That makes you mine to protect." The words hit her with unexpected force. After days of being hunted like prey, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Dakota shut the door firmly, setting the cabin in shadow once more. His hand brushed the hilt of his knife. He had chosen his side, and in the stillness that followed, Eliza knew. The storm outside had passed, but a storm of blood was coming. A storm did not ease by morning. The gray light of dawn seeped through cracks in the cabin walls, painting the world in ash and silver. Eliza stirred from a restless sleep, her body aching, her wound throbbing despite the makeshift bandage. The warrior had tied the night before. Her baby whimpered softly against her chest, hungry and restless. She looked around, expecting to find him watching her, but the spot near the hearth was empty. For a single breath, panic surged in her chest. Then, before she could stand, the door creaked open. He entered without sound, ducking beneath the low doorway, his long black hair damp with rain. The shirtless warrior's skin gleamed with droplets, tribal jewelry clinking faintly as he carried a bundle of wild roots and herbs tied in a strip of hide. He crossed the room with calm certainty, as though he had always belonged here, as though the small cabin had long been his to guard. Eliza swallowed hard. "Where were you?" The words slipped out sharper than she intended. driven by fear, glanced at her, dark eyes unreadable. "Watching," he said simply. He set the herbs on the table and crouched before the fire, coaxing the embers back to life with practiced hands. Sparks flared, smoke curled upward, and soon flames licked at the wood again. "Watching what?" Her voice trembled. "Men," he answered, his gaze flicking toward the window. 2 riders passed in the night. They circled. His tone was steady, but the tension in his jaw told her enough. This wasn't over. Whoever hunted her hadn't abandoned the chase. Her arms tightened around her baby. The child gave a soft cry, and she pressed her lips to his tiny forehead, her heart pounding. "They won't stop," she whispered, almost to herself. "They'll never stop." The warrior turned then, fully facing her. For the first time since she had stumbled into his life, his expression softened, not pity, not judgment, but something steadier, like a stone standing against a river. "You are safe here," he said. Eliza let out a bitter laugh, the sound jagged in her throat. "Safe? You don't know them. You don't know what they'll do if they find me." She looked down at her baby, tears threatening. "If they find him." He studied her in silence. The firelight caught on the bone necklace resting against his broad chest, on the scar that ran across his shoulder, proof that he too knew of violence, of survival bought with blood. "Tell me," he said at last. Her breath hitched. She wanted to keep it buried, wanted to pretend silence would keep the danger at bay. But his voice carried no demand, only quiet strength. She realized then that he was offering her something rare, space to release the weight she had carried alone. "They killed my husband," she said finally, the words trembling like brittle glass. "Men who wanted his land, his cattle. When he refused, they set fire to our barn. He tried to stop them." Her voice broke, but she forced it steady again. "They shot him. They burned everything. And when I ran, I took what little gold we had left, and the only thing they couldn't take, my son." Her confession hung in the air, heavy as smoke. The warrior's jaw clenched, but he did not look away. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture. "They hunt you because of the gold." Eliza met his eyes, her own brimming. "No, they hunt me because I lived, because I saw their faces. They can't let me tell." For a long moment, the storm outside was the only sound, a pounding rain, the wind tearing at the cabin. The baby whimpered again, and the warrior rose to his feet. He picked up one of the herbs he had gathered, crushing it between his fingers, the sharp scent of medicine filling the room. "I will help you heal," he said quietly. "And when they come, I will stand." Something in his voice, the calm conviction, the promise spoken as though it were already truth, shook her more than the storm ever could. Eliza's tears spilled silently down her cheeks as she rocked her child. She did not know his name, did not know why he had chosen to shield a stranger. But in that moment, for the first time since the night flames devoured her world, she believed. She was not alone. Outside, the rain hammered the land. Inside, within the fragile glow of firelight, a fragile alliance began to take root between a broken widow, her child, and a warrior who carried storms in his silence. The first warning came not with sound, but with a vibration. Eliza felt it before she heard it, an uneasy tremor through the floorboards of the cabin. A faint quiver, like the earth itself, was unsettled. She froze, her baby stirring against her chest, and looked to the warrior. He stood motionless by the window, his silhouette cut sharp against the faint gray light of dawn. The fire had burned low, and the shadows clung to his frame, yet the tension in his body made the room feel smaller. Tighter. Then the sound came. HOOFBEATS. At first, distant. Then louder. Then thunderous, a rolling echo across the soaked earth outside. Eliza's heart lurched into her throat, her hands instinctively clutching the baby so tightly he whimpered in protest. Fear prickled her skin, every nerve awake. Warrior's head turned slightly, long black hair falling across his bare shoulders, beads and bone glinting with every flicker of light. His jaw tightened. "They come," he murmured in a deep, gravelly tone. His voice was not raised, but it cut through the crackle of the fire, through the pounding in Eliza's chest. Her breath hitched. "How many?" He didn't answer right. Away. Instead, he shifted closer to the door, his broad chest rising and falling as he listened. Outside, the storm lashed on, but the horses were louder now, closer. Through a gap in the wooden shutter, she saw dark figures moving 5, maybe 6 riders. Hunched against the rain, their movements deliberate. These were not travelers caught in the storm. These were men on a mission. Eliza swallowed hard, her throat raw. She knew what they wanted. The gold. And if they discovered her, the child, and the warrior standing between them, blood would stain the mud before the morning broke. The warrior turned back to her, eyes burning like coals in the dimness. "You hide," he said simply, gesturing, with one powerful hand toward the far corner where the shadows were thickest. "Do not move. Do not cry out." "I?" She wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could help, that she wasn't helpless. But the words tangled with the fear, swelling inside her. All she could do was nod, clutch her baby close, and shuffle back into the corner where the flickering fire barely reached. Her body trembled with the effort of staying silent, every muscle tight. The warrior moved with a grace that was both silent and deadly. He lifted his blade from the floor, the steel flashing faintly as lightning forked outside. Shirtless, rainwater still dripping from his long black hair, he looked every inch the predator, lean, powerful, unflinching. Tribal jewelry adorned his chest and arms, symbols of a heritage rooted deeper than the soil beneath them. And in that moment Eliza realized something. This was his home, his ground. Those riders had no idea what awaited them. The first knock wasn't polite. It was a pounding, the kind meant to shake doors loose from hinges. "Open up," a voice bellowed, harsh and grating. Another knock followed, then another, each harder, more insistent. Eliza held her baby tighter, rocking him silently as fear clawed at her throat. The warrior did not answer. He simply waited, body poised, eyes sharp, blade ready. "Open this damn door or we burn you out." Another man shouted, his words slurred with drink, but his intent unmistakable. Lightning cracked, illuminating the small window. Eliza caught a glimpse of faces bearded, wet, twisted with greed. She recognized one, a man from town. The same man who had tried to follow her when she fled with the satchel. Her stomach turned to ice. The baby whimpered, and Eliza pressed a trembling hand over his back, whispering a prayer she barely believed anymore. The pounding grew louder. The wood groaned under the force. Then, suddenly, silence. The warriors. Body stiffened, his head tilting. He knew. He felt it. And then crash. The door splintered inward as 2 men stormed through, mud-slick boots pounding the floor. What followed was a blur of movement too fast for Eliza's eyes to catch. The warriors sprang like lightning, blade flashing. The first man fell before. He even raised his gun, a gurgle lost in the thunder outside. The second shouted, lunging forward, only to be met with a savage kick that sent him sprawling into the table, splitting it in half. Eliza gasped, covering her baby's eyes though. The child could not yet understand the violence unfolding. The cabin filled with the stench of sweat, blood, and rain-soaked leather. Outside, more voices rose, angry, shocked. "Get in there!" Someone roared. The warrior stood over the bodies, chest heaving, hair clinging wet to his skin. He turned, his head slightly toward Eliza, his eyes fierce but steady. "Stay," he commanded again. Then he stepped toward the broken door, where more shadows moved in the storm, and in that instant, Eliza realized he was not just protecting her, was preparing to fight for something greater than gold, for the child, for her, for his honor. And the battle had only just begun. The gunfire had stopped, but the echoes lingered in the canyon like ghosts refusing to leave. The storm, too, had finally broken, leaving only a damp silence and the acrid sting of smoke hanging in the air. The cabin door stood half-hinged, scarred, with bullet holes, a battered testament to the night's violence. Inside, the fire had burned low, throwing more shadows than light. Eliza sat near the hearth, her dress torn and bloodied, clutching her baby against her chest as though her very heartbeat was a shield. Her breath trembled, but her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were fixed on the figure that now leaned against the doorframe. Nalnish. His bare chest rose and fell heavily, muscles slick with sweat and streaked with dirt and blood. His long black hair clung in damp strands against his broad shoulders, and his tribal jewelry glinted faintly in the fire's dying glow. The rifle in his hand sagged as if it had grown too heavy to carry, and his body bore the raw marks of a battle that had demanded more than flesh. It had demanded his spirit. For a moment, he simply looked at her, not as a protector, not as a stranger, but as a man who had chosen to stand when no one else would. Eliza swallowed hard, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You saved us." Nalnish shifted, wincing as a cut along his side reopened. He gave a small shake of his head. "We saved each other." His words were simple, but they carried a gravity that made her chest tighten. She set the baby down gently, swaddled in the thin blanket, then rose on unsteady legs. Every step toward him was a battle against her pain, but she refused to let him stand alone in his. When she reached him, her hand trembled as it brushed his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the streaks of blood and rain. He did not flinch. Outside, the wind carried the faint cries of wounded men retreating, hooves fading into the distance. The threat had passed, at least for now, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Eliza glanced at the door, then back at Nalnish. "They'll return," she murmured, her voice tinged with both fear and certainty. Nalnish's jaw tightened. He gazed out into the wet night, then back into her weary eyes. "Let them." His tone was not arrogant, but resolute, as if he had already made peace with whatever fate awaited him. She wanted to argue, to beg him not to throw his life away, but the words caught in her throat, because deep down she knew he wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for her, for the fragile child asleep on the floor, for a sense of belonging neither of them had found until now. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper that broke the stillness. Eliza knelt quickly, gathering her child back into her arms. She kissed the infant's forehead, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "He deserves more than this world has given him," she whispered. Nalnish crouched beside her, his presence filling the small space like a shield. His calloused hand, adorned with a beaded bracelet, hovered near the baby, but he hesitated. Finally, Elisa took his hand and guided it gently until it rested over the child's tiny chest. The warrior's breath caught, his dark eyes softening as he felt the fragile rhythm of new life beneath his palm. For the first time that night, the weight on his shoulders seemed to ease. Eliza looked at him then, not as the fierce warrior who had stood against the storm, but as the man who might carry her and her child into a future she had not dared to dream. "We need a home," she said quietly, "and maybe so do you." Nalnish's gaze lingered on the baby, then lifted to her. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged in blood, rain, and fire. He rose slowly, extending his hand to her. "Then we build one." Eliza took it, her fingers small against his, but steady. Together, They stood in the wreckage of the night, two wounded souls bound not by chance, but by choice. As the first fragile light of dawn broke over the horizon, it spilled through the broken door, painting them in gold. The storm had passed. The riders were gone. And though the land outside still held its dangers, within that battered cabin, hope had found its way in. For Eliza, her child, and the warrior who had opened his door, a new story was only beginning.